Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast, brought to you by City Current and powered by Lipscomb & Pitts Insurance. This show shares personal stories and insight from those who are giving back and making a difference, so we can learn and do the same. We cover life lessons, business advice, passion, and purpose. Now here's our host, Jeremy Park.
Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. We have a fun treat. He flew in today to speak at our City Current events, so we get him literally right off the plane. So from the airport straight here, which is awesome. So we have Seth Mattison. He's an internationally renowned expert and author on workforce trends, generational dynamics, and business strategy. He's co-founder and chief movement officer for Illuminate Labs. His book is The War at Work. We'll talk all about that. But Seth, for starters, welcome to Memphis. How was your flight? How are you doing?
Jeremy, thanks for having me. Grateful to be here. You could have maybe had it be a little bit warmer, but that's fine.
That's
I
true.
came in from Phoenix, so I'm adjusting. We're in here in the studio. I got my jacket on still, but I'm grateful to be here and looking forward to a couple of days in town.
So it's going to be fun. Let's start, though, with a little bit of your backstory. Talk about where you grew up, and let's kind of dive in, and we'll get to Hollywood and everything in between. But talk about where you grew up.
So I grew up on a fourth-generation farm in southern Minnesota. So grew up working alongside my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. Really unique opportunity, 100-year-old farm. People often ask me, what was that like to grow up in that environment? Because we've sort of migrated outside of our rural communities into more urban areas, and so we've sort of lost touch to that. And I tell people all the time, particularly from a multi-generational farm standpoint, is these three dudes, they were very much, particularly my great-grandfather, he was the type of man that when he shook your hand, what he was really doing when he was greeting you was he was secretly checking for calluses on your hands.
Wanted to see if you were working.
You want to see if you were a worker, right? And that was like his big MO. And honestly, I think about that a lot as we're actually sitting here doing the podcast right now, and I'm looking at my pink fleshy hands.
Well, I'm wondering, do calluses, like for playing a musical instrument, does that count?
Correct. It's like just working out, going to the gym, and playing the guitar. Does that count? That would not have counted in his eyes. But that was the upbringing and sort of the genesis of my background. Went to school, state school in Wisconsin, lived in Minneapolis, and then chased my now wife, we've been together for 10 years, out to California. She was in broadcasting, and we have been Southern California based and now in the desert in Arizona in Scottsdale for the last 6 months. And it's good. It's a good place for us to be, to grow the business and God willing, raise a family.
Absolutely. So let's go back to on your end with your parents and in fourth generation. Was there a pretty rigid structure in terms of when you had to wake up and go work on the farm? Was it like how was that structure in terms of your childhood and growing up?
I'll tell you what stands out to me the most as it sort of relates to structure. So it was a dairy farm. We also grew corn and soybeans. But the thing about a dairy operation is that whether it's raining, snowing, sleeting, whether you're sick as a dog, there is no option about not getting out of bed. Right, the cows have to be milked. So every morning at 6 a.m. and every night at 5 or 5:30, it's like it just was. And not that I was always having to do that work because I was pretty little, but what I was seeing was the archetype of my father and my grandfather and great-grandfather in that schedule and in that routine. Particularly with my father, of just there was no option to not go. There wasn't such a thing as a sick day. You just learned to power through. And it really sort of led me to this ethos of grit and grittiness, which is celebrated and talked about a lot today.
Yeah. Especially here in Memphis, grit and grind is like our theme.
Is that the theme?
It is.
So, I mean, it's very quintessential of just, it wasn't celebrated at that time. I just was seeing it play out in real life.
Yeah.
And that's definitely stayed with me today. Not that the work I do can even compare in terms of just the toughness that was required to power through all of that. But in building businesses and being an entrepreneur and navigating the ups and downs, we've been doing this work, which we'll get into, for the past decade now, surviving 10 years on our own. The grittiness has served me well, for sure.
Before we dive in even further, one last one is give us one either family tradition or something that when you look back, especially on those years, what stands out as kind of a fun memory or something that you even take with you as, with your family today.
You know what? I think it's less a family tradition and more just about the growing up close to the earth, growing up in a farming community. You're very close to, the theme of just the seasons of life. Right, and so there's a season for planting and there's a season for harvesting, and you learn very quickly you can't just show up in the fall with your hands out if you didn't put the seeds in the ground in the spring, and it just sort of gets baked into who you are. When winter thaws, it's like you rest and you recharge. So there's a season, the season of winter, which you need to prepare for. In the spring, you show up and you go to work and there isn't an option, and you plant diligently and faithfully. And there's this huge element, and I think it's tremendously important for all the entrepreneurs. But, business executive leaders, there's value in this too. But for the entrepreneurs that are listening, one of the most important lessons that comes out of this theme of planting in the spring and staying close to the earth is you have to have this faithfulness and this willingness to relinquish control of the outcome. You have no control over how those crops are going to show up in the fall. All you can do is diligently plant, tend, pull the weeds, and then you have to relinquish the outcome. And that's really difficult for a lot of us as entrepreneurs. It's like we want to force, it's like...
Well, especially control freaks too.
Control freaks on top of it, right? Yeah. Of like, you cannot control the outcome, and you also have to surrender to the divine timing of it all. So that was that's been a consistent theme in my life, not only from growing up on the farm, but in everything that I've wanted. I'm sure there's a number of entrepreneurs right now that are hustling and planting, and they're saying, Seth, I've been tending to my crop for a long time.
Yeah.
When is it going to be time to harvest? Because we want it right now. And you got to surrender to the divine timing of all, and just remain faithful, control what you can control, and know that it will come in. And then learn how to receive that harvest. So that on the flip side of that is, for a lot of us, we're really good at showing up for other people, but we're not so good at receiving. And there's just as much methodology and mindfulness and faithfulness that goes into receiving abundantly and being open to that on the flip side. And so that whole, navigating the seasons of life, while not necessarily a family tradition, was just sort of deeply rooted in our philosophy of life.
Yeah.
That served me pretty well.
What's interesting is just even we live in such a fast-paced world, and when you hear kind of the season of even just being able to relax and kind of pull away and recharge.
Yeah.
I've got to believe that for many of us who struggle with that, and I self-admit even on my end, if you don't have that, you do burn out.
100%.
And so even being mindful of the seasons and saying, okay, at some point I do have to give myself a chance to recharge if I'm going to be more successful down the road.
You got to be thinking long game here. And so, again, that theme of, diligently going to work and being gritty and grinding away, it's not sustainable for most of us. Not only not sustainable from a mental well-being, from a physical standpoint, but also from a relationship standpoint. There's a lot of different factors that we can look at of how do we define success as a society and as business leaders and communities. But for us as individuals is just being really intentional of, I don't have to buy into or inherit everyone else's view of what is success. What is success for you? Success for you could be, if I could make whatever that number is, it's irrelevant. It doesn't have to be 7 figures, because that's what I see on Instagram, and my feed is the 7 secrets to the 7-figure year. That might not be what you want. And if you can get yourself in a place where you can confidently own that and say, if I could make $75,000, which we know from the research that the happiness quotient above $70,000 to $80,000 is very small en route to $1 million.
Interesting.
The people who make $75,000 a year collectively in their families are not the people who make $1 million are not exponentially more happy and fulfilled than those individuals. But yet we're caught up in a world of social media, and Instagram in particular, right, is feeding us a barrage of images that I need more. And if I do more, I can then be and feel more successful. I will feel fulfilled.
Right.
And it's a lie. But the only way you can sort of get outside of that trap is to take a step back and to be able to check in with yourself, do the inner work, to know thyself above all else, and decide and determine what success is going to mean for you. And I don't know that we're taught that in our educational systems and in business school for entrepreneurs, of saying, on the journey of building what you're building, how do you develop the practices to be able to tap into your own inner wisdom and knowing to design a life that is right for you, whatever that might be. Do it for yourself.
Yeah.
So I got off on a little bit of a tangent there. I don't even know exactly
this is all good stuff.
This up, but
hey, this is perfect.
I'm thinking about your entrepreneurs that are listening.
Well, but I think these are things that we all struggle with, and whether it's as an entrepreneur or as an executive or whatever it is. I think multitasking is the new norm, and we all struggle with, we get burned out. And so just being cognizant to your point about who we are and what we want and what our view of success is. And I think we also do get caught in that trap where, especially with social media and Instagram, you see the $1 million homes, the $1 million cars, the $1 million private jets. I mean, all these things. 100%. And it's like, I have to have that to be happy. And
correct.
Tom Shadyac says it all the time too.
To get that.
Yeah. Is that, ultimately, nature only takes what it needs to grow and thrive. So a tree only takes the amount of water and sunlight, and then it pushes the rest so that the rest of the world can enjoy it. And the only thing that continues to take and take and take and take and take is cancer. And so that's the part where you have to kind of self-evaluate and say, okay, what is enough for you and what do you enjoy? And it may be bikes, or we were talking about watches before, but whatever it is, ultimately you have your piece of happiness. But then the rest of it is use it to help others, use it to do other things, but ultimately be happy and don't kill yourself in the process.
Okay, but you bring up a really good point, Jeremy, and I think for this, I immediately think of all the executives and entrepreneurs that are building their businesses, but that idea of what is it that continuously grows and consumes its host is cancer, right? That continuous growth equals cancer, which eventually kills the host. Well, in our current, we open up a big conversation about just our current model of capitalism and how most of our businesses, right? I do about 75 live events every single year. Half are with individual companies, half are either associations or community events like this. Every single one of them has a theme of growth. Continuous growth. We want more growth. We grew at 8% this year. We want to grow at 12% next year. And having the opportunity just to take a step back and to say, how much is enough?
Yeah.
And what are the metrics we are using to measure success?
Right.
If our only metrics, right? So if you're an executive, if you're a business owner and you're listening to this and you say, if I were to ask you, how do you determine whether or not last year was successful or not? And we say, well, it was based on revenue and growth. In my opinion, that is going back to that idea of we've become wealthy in some really poor ways. What would be some additional KPIs that we could use to determine whether or not my business, my organization in this community has been successful? What might be some benchmarks? Maybe I factor in there where employee engagement is, where employee happiness. Maybe it be the level of, can we measure growth and development opportunities that we created for our people? Can we measure that in community impact and how much we were? Is that a line item that we point to that is not a subset underneath growth and revenue, but sits equally on that plane? Because when we get into the business realm, we keep it completely separate to this theory that we all know of what is cancer.
Yeah.
Cancer ultimately kills the host. And I think we're beyond a reasonable doubt that if we stay on our current trajectory, we will deplete the resources of this earth. It's just easy to point at everyone else and to say, that's a big problem. Someone else will solve that. That's happening at an international level. I'm just here running my little business in my little community. that may be true, but if everyone takes the ownership of saying, how do I lead and build a company that operates with principles that are sustainable, that allow us to grow in a way that feels like it's enough but supportive. And what exactly is that number? I'm not here to tell people what that number is, but I see myself as a facilitator of transformation to start to bring some of these beautiful conversations to the table and just say, we've sort of inherited a paradigm about what leadership and work and commerce and capitalism is supposed to look like and mean, and we don't have to. It doesn't mean that it's all bad. It doesn't mean that we blow it all up and we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's just saying we get to actually decide what we want the new era, the next new iteration, the new paradigm of business and leadership to be about. And that's what gets me really excited, and excited to spend time with people such as yourself that are making such an impact in the communities that you're operating in, like you are.
Well, and I greatly appreciate it. And I'll tell you what's interesting about everything you're talking about, not just from a business lens, but from a nonprofit lens. So you're seeing these questions now asked by nonprofits and funders and philanthropists alike, and it's coming out of the Robin Hood Foundation and even organizations like Slingshot Memphis here, where, to your point, as an organization, especially a nonprofit, you're kind of pushed to do more, right? To serve more. And so all of a sudden you come out and you say, well, we served 100,000 people. Okay, well, that's great. Maybe you're serving them, but you only serve them one meal per person for the year, right?
Sure.
So you've had one meal for 100,000 people, so you've technically served 100,000 people. But you compare that to an organization that literally is helping 100,000 people, or served 100,000 meals, we'll say, but it was 5 meals a day or 3 meals a day to the individual. So the point is, and I'm getting my numbers wrong, but you get the point.
Sure.
The point is it's not just about numbers and impact and growth over there, as it is how effective are you really at creating change and not getting tripped up by the big numbers and having constant growth over there versus impacting a life and really taking a holistic approach and saying, okay, Seth, you're coming in. I got to feed you 3 times a day to get where you need to be. I've got to make sure and tutor you and get you your GED and help you with work-life skills and all those kind of things so that ultimately you're equipped for success, and it's not a silver bullet approach. And I think, kind of back to the point is you're seeing even that sort of mindset saying we're not asking the right questions. We've got to ask more detailed questions. We've got to really look at grade the right things so that we even know the numbers we're getting are the right numbers based on what we're trying to accomplish. So I think the point is these conversations are having not just in business but in community as well.
They are, to do what you just described right there. When that was starting to come to light in my mind, what immediately jumped up was, in order to do any of those things, it requires leaders who operate from a position of humility, though. Because to be able to say what we have been doing, even if technically it's been,
and in some cases funding success for millions of dollars might not have worked.
Exactly. And to say, okay, is there a better way? Is there a new way? Do we have all of the answers? That takes a heart posture of humility. And especially if people's identities have gotten wrapped up in what they do and in those organizations, to question the organization is then to essentially question them as individual leaders and their identity. And if you can separate those two and operate from a place of, and go back to why are we doing this and who are we doing this for, and step into that mindset of a servant leader, it allows you to then ask those questions and be open to new and different ways of approaching it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good tangent. Let's go back.
Yeah.
So talk about
let's rewind here now.
But I mean, all that I think is context for actually what you're doing. So I mean,
absolutely.
I think it's pretty easy for listeners to get a feel for. Okay, I see where Seth's heart is and where he's coming from, and obviously where you're passionate about. But ultimately, these are the very things that you're looking to tackle. Is how do you create the paradigm shifts? How do you create transformation? How do you open people's eyes and say, are we asking the right questions? Are we just getting caught up in the numbers games? So talk about Luminate Labs. I mean, give us an idea of what you do.
So let's go back 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, I find myself sitting in an empty parking lot at like 6:30 in the morning, and my heart is absolutely racing because I'm about to walk into a clinic that takes blood platelet donations. And my heart is racing because this is right at the turn of 2008. The Great Recession is in full effect. And I have convinced 2 best-selling authors on the subject of generational shifts, generational dynamics, to essentially take me on their platform and their team, which they agreed to, but unfortunately did not have the resources to be able to really compensate me. And so I was leaving the management consulting realm, full-time paycheck world that I had been in, and was proceeding with faith, and in hopes of being able to do this work of being an author and a speaker. But there was no money, there was no income. And so to supplement this, I started to donate blood platelets. But somewhere along that journey of donating, someone planted the thought worm in my mind that, when you go in, they check your blood pressure. And if for some reason your blood pressure is a little high, your heart rate is a little high that day, you can be turned away. And that morning when I'm sitting in my car, this is the spring of 2009, early in the morning, I know that I don't have enough money to fill my car up with gas to get back home. So I have to be able to donate. But the thought worm has crept into my mind that if my heart rate is a little elevated, I'm not going to be able to. And I walk in, and as I walk in and the door swings shut behind me, I can just feel my heart rate already going up. Trying to calm it down, I slide my arm into that blood pressure sleeve, that we've all had our arms in. And as it starts to tighten up around my arm, my heart rate is jacked. And of course, I get denied. And I would continue to get denied for the next 3 weeks. I could not get this under control. And after the last time, the 3rd week, as I'm pulling my arm out of that sleeve and I'm trying to hide my face and the tears that are running down my eyes from the nurse, I walk out to my car. And as I get in my car, I really learned that first lesson we talked about in the beginning, which was the need to surrender to divine timing. Because I had been in this place of, I wanted this thing to happen so bad, to get to break in, to be able to do this work, to teach, to share. And it felt like it was slipping away. And despite how bad I wanted it, I couldn't control the timing of it. And it was in that moment that I had to just sort of surrender and say, you know what, this is outside of my control. And if it is to be, it will be. And fortunately, enough things came together to see me through that moment. But all of my work to this day now, where we've been fortunate coming out of that, and we're on a 10-year run now of doing 70, 80 plus events. We've got to travel all over the world. I never forget how that felt in that moment and what was at stake in order to get a shot into this game. We were able to go on a run of almost 5 years with these 2 authors. Their names were David Stillman and Lynn Lancaster. They wrote a bestseller back in 2002 called When Generations Collide. They were one of the first sort of thought leaders in the early 90s around the subject. I got to help them in the writing of their second book called The M Factor, how the millennial generation was going to rock the workplace. And today we hear about, millennials all the time through every single outlet. Yeah. But back in 07, 08, 09, partially we weren't inundated with all of our new forms of technology and communication. But it was an early topic, and I got really lucky in that I caught the early wave of that subject. And I had an opportunity to learn the craft of working with a client, speaking, moving an audience through content from 2 world-class speakers. David was a Gen Xer, Lynn was a baby boomer, so I got great generational perspective. They sold that business after 4 years, and when they did, it gave me a really beautiful opportunity to pivot my research and my brand. I wanted to talk about more than just generations, and I pivoted and refocused all of our energy and efforts under more of this theme of the future of work. And fortunately, we had enough momentum in the industry and with clients that when we pivoted and went on our own, we had enough people who were basically like, you know what, we'll give you a shot with the new content and sort of your new research that you're putting out there. Well, we probably wouldn't have gotten 2 or 3 shots, but fortunately it hit and it worked. And we've spent the last 5 years expanding that research. Obviously, that theme of the future of work is very broad.
Yeah. Well, and it's constantly changing, too.
And it's constantly changing.
Yeah.
And I've had to continuously check in with myself on just, the beauty of it is that it is broad, and there's a lot of great things to talk about. The challenge of it is so broad, you can wake up and every day can be like, there's a lot of shiny objects that you can talk under that theme. Are we talking about digital transformation? Are we talking about AI? Are we talking about machine learning? Are we, fill in the blank, go down the line. Where, look over here, do some research on this.
The desks that rise.
Correct.
And work, everything. Yeah, exactly.
Work, all of that. And so I had to learn how to continually check in with myself of, what do I think are the more compelling messages, the sort of unconventional topics and themes that aren't being talked about, that are important. And the first one that really bubbled up, which is the basis and the foundation of our book, The War at Work, was we looked at the future through this lens of these two dynamic forces that are battling it out, which are hierarchies and networks. So we sort of looked at the future through the lens of hierarchies and networks, and essentially saying, as we're becoming more and more aware of it today, we're entering this era that has been called the age of the networks. We're surrounded by a digital existence where our phones, our technology, our education, everything around us, one big giant network.
Everything's connected, and we believe our workplaces and right. But the challenge is that as we move into that world, we are, for most of us, and most of the leadership that I get to work with on a daily basis did not come of age in that world. Almost everyone that I'm interacting with that's an executive or a leader came of age in a world where the structures and, more importantly, the deeply embedded culture of hierarchy has been our reality. And these two worlds, this new emerging world of network and our existing traditional historical world of hierarchy, they're battling it out. It's like these two unseen forces. And every company I go into, and this has been true now for over 5 years, we've vetted out this research and worked with clients from the Lockheed Martins of the world to the Microsofts to the small operators in transportation and manufacturing and hospitality. There is this undercurrent of those two forces that ultimately are dictating whether or not a company and a culture can evolve into this new networked world. Peter Senge out of MIT has some phenomenal research. For those who are unfamiliar, Peter has spent almost 5 decades researching and writing about systems thinking and organizational theory and behavior. And about a year and a half ago, he and I shared a stage with one of the biggest financial service firms in the world. And Peter said to this room full of leaders, he said, organizational structures, i.e. hierarchy, are mirrored in our assessments, thinking, and mental models. They form the basis of our understanding and the very nature of our reality. Essentially what he was saying to this room was that the longer we had operated inside of these historical structures of hierarchy, the more it had not just slightly influenced how we think about leadership and work, but that what the science had shown was that it had literally rewired our brains, and that we then saw the world through this lens. We lived in that paradigm. And so, but we're unaware of it. When you're in a paradigm, you're unconscious of it. What's interesting, even when we're talking about the hierarchy, you've got obviously titles, CEOs and those, and power structure, and you have the military, and there's the structure there. But even going back to our original conversation just about consuming and getting consumed with like money.
Yes.
There's a hierarchy even there in terms of financial.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
What's interesting is just as you're talking, it's like you can easily see how the hierarchies play and would rewire our brain, but play such a vital role even outside of the workplace.
They do. And hierarchies influence all levels of society.
Yeah.
From the highest levels of governmental structures, right? Hierarchy shows up in religious structures, organizational structures, government structures, our nonprofit institutions. And it's not that there is necessarily anything inherently wrong in hierarchy. What I've been working on our clients with and hope to introduce and just add a little insight with our time together is, where does it serve us and where is it preventing us from truly leading, living, and operating in this new world that's operating in true networked form,
and
allowing us to sort of set a new set of guiding principles. Because there's a whole set of values and beliefs that were deeply ingrained about what it means to be a leader in subtle ways that influence and shape how we then go back and guide our organizations, build our cultures, and ultimately define the future. I give people a really I don't know if it's simple, but I try to distill it down into kind of a tangible soundbite. When we say hierarchies and networks, it's a little big and heady of like, well, what do we mean by that? Think about it like this. Hierarchy historically provided a lot of security, stability, and consistency, but very little freedom, right? So it was like we defined things. It was clear, consistent, tightly controlled, but there was very little freedom in that. With network provides lots of freedom, but with it comes ambiguity and uncertainty.
It can be scary. That's right.
It can be scary.
Yeah.
As things move and change very fast.
Yep.
And so the question I pose to leaders to just sort of summarize and anchor it, because you can go deep, but just at a high level, is think about where do we need to control situations in the organization, and where does freedom need to live in the organization? Where can we breathe more freedom? And if I'm trying to breathe more freedom into the organization, what's going to be required? With great freedom comes great responsibility and ownership. So how do I embed some of those core themes to allow us to sort of dissolve some of the unwritten rules that have come with old school sort of hierarchical ways of being? But it's not even just like, manufacturing old school, hierarchy is old school. There's plenty of new quote unquote cool cutting edge cultural organizations that have tons of hierarchy steeped in them. We've seen it. And so this has been a big part of my work of defining the future in a way and bringing a conversation that's not being talked about that I believe will help facilitate a paradigm shift in the way in which leaders show up and the type of companies they build.
Hey, Andrew Bartolotta here, producer of the ChangeMakers podcast powered by City Current. Did you know that City Current is a catalyst of over 100 partners joining forces and funds to power the good through events, media, and philanthropy? Here's how you too can join our efforts. Be sure to follow us on social media at City Current, subscribe to our podcast, and check out our positive media at citycurrent.com. Thanks for listening. Now back to the show.
What's amazing is you're talking a lot and even carrying it forward a little bit. Joshua Cooper Ramo wrote The Seventh Sense, and he talks a lot about networks and the real power of like the smart car is not necessarily one smart car. It's us being connected and them learning from each other across the network, right?
Yes.
But with the network, to your point, it becomes very scary. So his point, and he kind of predicted Brexit and a lot of the stuff that was going on and is going on, is the fact that you get networked in, you love it, and all of a sudden the network opens up and you learn, but then all of a sudden it gets really scary, and so your natural instinct is to pull in, and so you contract.
And contract a hierarchy oftentimes.
Yep.
It's this constant, right?
Exactly.
Back and forth. And again, that's where I say, early in the research, I was sort of like, hierarchy is archaic, it's dead, it's bad, network is the future, network is going to consume hierarchy. And then after spending more time in the trenches, inside organizations and doing more of the research, where we landed was that it's really a balancing act of both. It's not about either blowing up. There's a great book written by the author Niall Ferguson. It's called The Square and the Tower. And what Niall did is he gives us, he basically, this came out, I believe, a year ago, the historical context, a historical sort of background of the battle between hierarchies and networks, giving like one of the first examples of it is the printing press in the Catholic Church, right? Because it was the printing press, what did it do? It created free access to, essentially people's access to God, source, information to be able to read. So you could have a relationship outside of the church, and the Catholic Church in that time wanting to, control. And so they're like first examples of, and how did that play out? And then all of these iterations over the decades and centuries since then. And this is just...
And now it's playing out in the workplace.
Playing out in the workplace. You mentioned Brexit. All levels of society.
Yeah.
And when we're aware of it again, the whole idea is once we become aware of it, then we can make intentional choices about how we're designing moving forward.
Yep.
So I don't come as the basher of hierarchy. I'm sort of trying to, number one, raise awareness of the paradigm that we're in. so that we can then make a new choice and shift into
Well,
new
and even to your
space.
point before about how some of the most cutting edge still have the hierarchy in place, right? So now it's a
Yes.
matter of, like a consultant, any good consultant, it's not, hey, everything is good or bad, as it
Yes.
is, wait a second, let's take the best of all the worlds and what's right for you in this situation. And also, too, knowing that situation evolves and changes.
Yes.
So you constantly have to have your pulse on it.
You do.
Give us one, obviously it's impossible, but give us one of your just favorite tips in general. It could be a question to ask. It
Sure.
could be getting a pulse on your company. It can be something specific. But what's just one kind of teaser tip?
Well, I'll sort of summarize it of this. When we say sort of finding that balance between hierarchies and networks, how are companies doing that? And what does it mean for the individual? Because I'm always trying to anchor back to that too of like, okay, what's the company versus the individual? So we identified 5 shifts that the best of the best organizations that recognized it and were bridging the gap are doing. And that breaks down like this. There's a technology shift that has to take place, which is the most recognizable and most implemented shift. People see network is happening. We're going to plug technology in to unleash network-like behavior inside the organization. But then they usually stop. And then they wonder why it's not fully realized. It's like, brother, you're all still walking around with the same unwritten rules from the freaking hierarchy.
But we have an iWatch on now.
Exactly. So there's a technology shift, a process shift, which is really where agile methodology and design thinking type concepts come into play. There's a skills shift that has to take place of what are the new sort of skills and competencies that leaders need to embrace. That are, if you're no longer leading from the top of the hierarchy, but if you were to instead say lead from the center of the network, what does that look like? What are those new skills and competencies? There's an experience shift that takes place where most of your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with the experience economy, employee experience, no longer just customer experience. How are we shaping and curating those? And then the 5th and final shift is what we call the inner shift. The inner work. And what I mean by this, and this leads me full circle back to your question, what's the one tip? The first 4, technology, process, skills, and experience, those are all, quote unquote, what we would call the outer work. It's the doing. It's what most people think they get paid their salaries to be focused on. And we spend about 90% of our time focused on the doing, the working on the outer work of the business. And we spend about 10% or less on this, what we call inner work. This is the being part. Here's what I've discovered 10 years of this work. We're focusing on the wrong. We're fiddling at the edges to create true transformation. It is not about what the company is doing. It is about who the leaders are being. I cannot have a conversation. Like those of you that heard that will know what I'm talking about. It is not about what the company is doing. It is about who the leaders are being. True transformation has to start in that place. It starts with the leaders. It starts with a conversation about who are we being? Who must we become? And it requires this deep inner work. So if you go full circle back to the beginning of our conversation about how and where we're spending our time, and you ask the average leader today across industries, where in your day do you have time to do quote unquote inner work? And inner work can be defined in a lot of different ways. Meditation, mindfulness, prayer. It could be a walk in nature, somewhere where you are unplugged from not only technology, but the outside noise, so that you can tap into your greatest source of wisdom, which resides inside of you, right? You are a tuning fork to be able to access that, to be able to make really clear choices and decisions about who you are and what you believe and what that vision is. If you don't start there, all of the doing will never create the transformation that you really want. One of my favorite quotes comes from Otto Scharmer out of MIT, and he said, before we can create an external shift in our organizations, an internal transformation must first occur within. But most of the time we get caught up and filled with anxiety of that. If I'm doing inner work, if I did 20 minutes of meditation and 20 minutes of journaling, to identify some of these things so I could start to hear my own inner knowing, it couldn't possibly be work. In fact, the little voice in my head is screaming at me, Seth, that I've got to start answering emails or I'm going to fall behind. And you have to be able to quiet that noise and know that creating quantum change requires the being. It's like Yoda, there is no trying, there is only to do.
Well, and I think too, culture trumps strategy, every day of the week. And to your point, not just even knowing yourself and that being the true north, but also too, to your point about the leadership. Once again, I'm not going to do the story justice, but the point is, one of my friends was telling me how he went in and there was a problem, and ultimately the person on the front lines took care of it and said, I don't even have to go further up the food chain. I know this is the right thing to do, and our company would want it to be done. And it hit him, and he was sharing it with me because that was his point, is that there was no strategy necessarily there. It was just they knew the ethos of the company. The culture was so strong that it was the right thing to do, and everybody had taken ownership of it. And I think everything you're talking about, it's knowing yourself, but ultimately when you are leading a company, leading an organization, out there even just leading yourself, good attracts good. People notice. And with that, you create a ripple effect that ultimately you couldn't put a strategy behind if you tried to.
No. You just summarized basically our whole conversation with that one example and a couple of things. Number one, he said, I didn't have to run it up the food chain, i.e., up where? Yeah. Hierarchy, right? Yeah. Paradigm, mental model. Yeah. So you've just confirmed that. And he didn't have to because he understood it was baked into the culture. Now, here's the final closing point I want for leaders to take away from this, because again, you want to summarize it down, what the company does versus who the leaders are being. I get leaders all the time. I'm sure you hear this in the community too. Nonprofit, for-profit, doesn't matter. How do I get people who care about and are passionate about what we do? You can't make anyone care about what you do. All you can do is share what you care about. That's it. I can't make any of my audiences ultimately believe what I believe. As a leader, when it comes to culture, all you can do is share what you believe. And you will then attract people who, if they believe what you believe, or if they aspire to believe what you believe, they will come and be aligned to that. But what does that mean? That means as a leader, you have to have an amazing skill to be able to communicate in a clear and compelling way what you believe.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's awesome. Well, this is one of those we could go on and on forever and have you come back over and over. But let's do this. Let's kind of switch over. It's kind of our rapid fire.
Sure.
Just short questions, short answers, and we'll wrap up.
I don't know if I'll have a good answer.
Yeah, that's all right. These are all fun ones.
I'm nervous now.
These are fun ones. These are easy. So give us a recent book you've read.
A recent book I've seen. The Book of Freedom. The Book of Freedom by Paul Selig. Unbelievable. Transforming my life right now.
There you go.
Put that on your list.
A recent movie or TV show?
I just rewatched Band of Brothers on HBO. I'm a huge World War II fan and buff, and I think that's one of my favorites. 10-part series. Watch it, please.
Nice.
It's great.
Give us a favorite restaurant in your hometown and where you are now.
So Los Angeles, we just spent 10 years out there. One of my favorite restaurants. It's a little commercially, people might roll their eyes, but I really like it. It's called Catch in West Hollywood. Phenomenal.
Nice.
Yeah.
And then what about where you are now?
Now we're in Scottsdale.
Yeah.
There's a brand new restaurant that just opened up that's very similar called Ocean 44 in downtown Scottsdale. And they just absolutely nailed it in terms of, you know how it's hard to get the ambiance right with like music that's not too loud so you can still talk, but it's not dead. There's a good vibe. The food is phenomenal. They top to bottom got it right. Ocean 44.
Nice.
There's a plug for free. I got nothing coming out of it.
Well, this is the fun stuff. Is just it's an easy chance to learn more about you and just what makes you tick, but also to some fun promo as well.
Totally.
For those who are traveling, give us something you like to do to relax. You mentioned meditate.
Yeah. So we travel a lot. I'm on the road a lot. And that was part of our move from Los Angeles to Scottsdale was I wanted faster, quicker, easy access to nature. to just sort of unplug. That's been a big theme, peace and ease for me. And so for my wife and I, we love to get outdoors, hike, and then I'm also an athlete, and my wife played college tennis, and so if anything that lets us compete, we're not playing a lot of tennis anymore because we're getting old, but we're playing more pickleball and paddle tennis, sort of like old people tennis.
Hey, it's still fun.
Still
it's good
fun.
workout. Absolutely.
Still fun.
Give us something that you and your wife outside of the sports. What's something you like to do? I mean, you mentioned nature, obviously, in sports, but like a place to go and visit, or where do you like to go?
We love to travel together, and we travel well together. That was one of the things that I fell in love with her the most early on. Was she was a no frills, no nonsense, easy traveler.
So you guys could get along doing like the Great Race and all those kind of things together.
You know what?
My wife and I would probably she would kill me.
We honestly talk about that all the time.
Why are you doing that?
Now listen, I would probably have to default to her making yes dear. Right? That's a big theme in our house.
I would have to do the same.
Happy wife, happy life.
That's right. I'm
a big believer in that. But yes, we talk about that amazing race type teamwork stuff all the time. We'd be good at that.
Give us you mentioned kind of a lot of things that you follow, but give us one other, whether it's website, a person. Who else do you like to follow on your end that inspires you?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Aubrey Marcus. He's based in Austin. He's got a book called Own the Day. He built a big nutrition, health, and wellness sort of human optimization company called On It. Alpha Brain was their first product that Joe Rogan really pushed a number of years ago, and has just turned this thing into a monster. But what I respect about him is he has he may have some unconventional views on business and spirituality, but he's found a way to thread the needle of talking about sort of how he sees the world in a really vulnerable and authentic way. That is inspiring and empowering to me, and so that would be someone that his pod. I mean, I think he's one of the top 4 or 5 podcasters in the world. So I'm a big Aubrey fan.
What's a quote, a phrase, a saying? What's something that inspires you?
I'm so glad.
I'm seeing you already looking at your.
So y'all can't see this because you're listening, but I am opening. I had my journal out. This is a leather-bound journal. I bring my journal everywhere I go, every meeting. This one was given to me from my wife on my 37th birthday. But there's a quote on the inside. That's why I was excited. This is not written down. This is actually imprinted in the journal, and it's actually my favorite quote. And it says. Sometimes it takes a long time to sound like yourself. Miles Davis. And I don't know if there's a quote that rings more true for me in sort of my evolution and continued evolution as to the work that I'm trying to do. Sometimes it takes a long time to sound like yourself. When we first start out, and I'm sure some of your listeners can relate to this, we emulate those that we look up to. And we are grappling with and trying to find our most authentic voice and gifts. And if you can keep hammering away on it, right, the people who ultimately find and discover it and then are brave enough to reveal it, in whatever that is, whatever your art is, those are the people that we celebrate. And it is my continual journey to keep trying to find and sound more like myself.
The interesting thing is the last question I ask, which I'll still ask this, but you basically just answered is, you're working every day to create your legacy. What do you hope your legacy is? And so I think you kind of hit it right there, but is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, from my legacy is to essentially answer 3 really important questions: to know who I am, to know what I am, and to know exactly how I serve, to leave an institution and a platform that continues to help people find their way back home to those answers long after I'm gone. And we found an outlet and a way in which to do this work right now across a couple of different sources and with a couple of different groups that we try to serve well. But thinking in terms of generational legacy and not momentary likes, in a world that is obsessed and consumed by social media and Instagram, is sort of my North Star every single day. Am I working on something that's leading towards generational legacy, or is this for a momentary like? And that's been a pretty good guidepost for the work that we try to do.
Absolutely. Last question is always the easiest one, is just where do we go to learn more, stay in touch? So social media, website, where would you direct us?
Easy to find. Everything is either SethMattison.com or at Seth Mattison. That handle is our handle for LinkedIn, for Instagram, for Facebook. Facebook we've sort of shut down. That's not a plug or a detraction. Just we're most active on probably Instagram and LinkedIn at Seth Mattison. And I look forward to connecting and following and joining the conversation. And it goes back to what we said before. If you believe what we believe, I think there's some really important work, which I believe what you believe. And I think that's why we're here together to do this work here in Memphis.
I agree 100%. Well, Seth, absolute pleasure having you on the podcast, and greatly appreciate it. So hope everyone enjoys it, and follow the conversation online and go to SethMattison.com and obviously at Seth Mattison. So Seth, thanks for all you do for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
Thank you for listening to the ChangeMakers podcast, produced by City Current and powered by Lipscomb and Pitts Insurance. To learn more about our guests and to share your stories of others leading by example, visit us online at citycurrent.com. Connect with us online using @CityCurrent or follow the conversation using the hashtag ChangeMakers. Now, think big, start small, and act now. Be a change maker.